Sam, thanks for coming on. I really appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Yeah, sure. So my name's Sam Lebens. I work at the University of Haifa in the north of Israel. I work on a whole load of philosophical issues in metaphysics, the philosophy of language, the history of early analytic philosophy, and also the philosophy of religion, which is why I think you've reached out to me.
Cool. So could you tell me more about Pascal's wager and your view on Pascal's wager?
Well, sure. So in a nutshell, I mean, it's a very famous argument, of course, right? Pascal's one of the founders of decision theory, and he intimates in his writings that the kind of ideal better, right? Somebody trying to place bets on how things likely are to be or whatnot, would be well placed to place a bet on God's existence, and more specifically on the truth of Catholicism. He seems to think that we betters would have lol Pascal's wager in 2022. Well, give it a chance, Travis. Let's hear what I have to say about it, because I don't actually think it's all that good an argument, but I think that it can be retooled even in 2022. Okay, so what he says is that you've got good reason to bet on Catholicism. He basically says you've got nothing to lose, and the way he tries to kind of calibrate the bet is something like this: if Catholicism is false and you betted for it, well, big deal. So you turned out to have been wrong. You backed the wrong horse. Atheism was true, let's say, not Catholicism. But, you probably had quite a nice life anyway, maybe wasting some time praying and Bible studying, but maybe those things brought with them certain social goods anyway. And when you die, you know nothing better, because you just die and disappear if atheism's true, I assume. But he says, if you bet on Catholicism and you were right, you bet on Catholicism being true and Catholicism is true, then you get like eternal reward, like this infinite good. And if you bet on Catholicism not being true and it turns out to be true, then you're in terrible, terrible trouble, hell and purgatory and whatever. And he calibrates the kind of expected utilities in decision theory terms, or at least we're supposed to reconstruct that on his behalf. And for him, it's a no-brainer that Catholicism ends up being true. Now you may have noticed from my head where this doesn't mean I'm a Catholic cardinal. It's the wrong color. I'm an Orthodox Jew. In fact, I am, as well as being a professor of philosophy, I'm a rabbi. So I have to reject Pascal's wager, right? Because it's an argument for Catholicism. And it's actually a very, very bad argument, right? And this is why Travis laid right in straight away with an emoji. And placing bets, doesn't the house always win, right? There are loads of different arguments you can raise against Pascal's wager. Okay, the first, and I think the most important, I mean, one of them, and this Graham Oppy has played with, as many other critics of the argument, is that decision theory doesn't actually cope very well when you add infinite values into the decision matrices, right? So when you're dealing with heaven and hell, and you're supposed to give them heaven is supposed to have an infinitely good expected utility, and hell is supposed to have an infinitely bad expected utility, decision theory just kind of crumbles. Decision theory is a great way of kind of deciding where to place your bets when you're dealing with finite values. When you're dealing with infinite values, it just kind of breaks down. other people like Liz Jackson have responded to that problem and have responded in interesting ways. And actually, you know, Mike Rota has a really nice book defending Pascal's wager, where he models the whole thing using finite values and you know, somewhat arbitrarily, but the argument seems to go through on that front. I think a better argument is what Diderot called the many gods argument, or it's Diderot didn't call it that. It got called the many gods argument. It was first put forward by Denis Diderot, and his point was, well, ultimately Diderot's point was, well, there are loads of different gods, aren't there? Right. So which one are you supposed to back? Pascal makes it sound like it's just a coin flip between Catholicism or atheism, but we know that's not the case, right? It's more like a many-sided die, right? There's atheism, but then there's belief in Zeus, there's belief in the God of the Old Testament, there's the belief in the God of the Old and New Testament, there's the belief in Muhammad as the prophet, and you can get these really weird results that actually you should bet for the God who promises the best heaven and the worst hell, because you're trying to kind of hedge your bets. Or what happens if maybe there's a God who just hates wagers, and he'll give you heaven as long as the only thing you did in life is you never wagered, right? That would be that would be devastating to Pascal. William James tried to modify Pascal's wager to mitigate the problem of many gods, and he said, well, it's legitimate for us to distinguish between what he calls live options and non-live options, and I think this is very problematic. But he somehow wants to say, like, if you're living in the east coast of America, Hinduism isn't a live option. The Greek pantheon of gods isn't a live option. It's just Christianity or atheism. And then the wager comes back. And you're like, hold on a minute, but why do you get to decide which options are live and which options aren't live? And this is where I step in. I try to give an account, a more systematic account of what makes options rationally live and what it means for an option to be live. And I think it just depends on your own cultural, epistemic, social position in life as to which options are live and which options aren't live. And I think there are at least some people for whom there are only two live options: atheism or a culturally salient religion, whatever that religion may be. And that if you are in one of those positions in which there are only two salient live options, a particular religion or atheism, then I think Pascal's wager is rationally compelling. If you're not in such a situation, I don't think it's rationally compelling.
Well, what do you mean by a live option?
Okay, so let me put it this way. There are some things which philosophers would call unthinkable. And what they mean by unthinkable is nicely cashed out by Harry Frankfurt, the great American philosopher, in terms of, he calls it volitional necessity. What he means is there are some things which you can't bring yourself to think. Now, he doesn't mean literally you can't think them. Let me give you an example. Let's say you have someone who you love, who needs a heart transplant. And the only way to get them a transplant is to find an innocent bystander and kill them in such a way that renders them brainstem dead, but salvages the heart. You could do that, and that would save your beloved. But you don't. But that's unthinkable to you. It's unthinkable to you to go and harvest an innocent person's heart. What I mean unthinkable? Wait, you can think about it. We're thinking about it right now, but it's not the sort of option that you factor in to your practical deliberations. Here's another example. Solipsism. Okay, solipsism is the view that only you exist and that everybody else is just a figment of your imagination. I don't think you can prove solipsism to be false, but I take it that you find it unthinkable, that you wouldn't factor it into your practical deliberations. When I have to think about whether I'm going to call my mother on Friday evening, she likes to hear from me at least once a week, I don't even factor into my practical deliberations, but maybe she doesn't really exist. Maybe she's just a figment of my imagination. I can save myself some time. It's unthinkable. Of course, some things start off being unthinkable, but then they become thinkable when you get like an overwhelming amount of evidence in their favor. So an example I like to use is, to me, it's unthinkable that that my wife wants to kill me. And I think it would rationally take me, I think it's rationally acceptable that it would take more evidence to convince me that that she wants to kill me than it would perhaps to convince a neutral bystander. And I think that there's lots of different technical epistemological issues here in the background. Pragmatic encroachment is the technical term for it. And I don't actually go in for this notion called pragmatic encroachment. The way I would explain it is just like this. The hypothesis that my wife is trying to kill me is one which is unthinkable for me, given the stakes, given the network of relations in which I stand, given all these variables, it's unthinkable to me. And therefore I don't even, I don't factor it into my practical deliberations at all until somebody can give me an overwhelming amount of evidence. If you give me an overwhelming amount of evidence, you can kind of like vivify something that until now wasn't live, wasn't thinkable. So I think there are some people who, given the situation they have in life, take me, for example, the amount of evidence you'd have to give me that Christianity was true would be overwhelming, because I'm an Orthodox rabbi, for God's sake, right? I'd like the cost to me of accepting Christianity would be huge, right? My wife would probably have to leave me. What would happen with our kids, because she's a convinced Orthodox Jew, right? What would it do to my career? Now you might think that all of these things are not, epistemically rigorous or honest considerations, but I think they are. They're practically relevant to practical rationality and to practical deliberations. Christianity, because it's such a costly option for me, would require more evidence than it would for somebody else. And until I get a lot of evidence, it's just not a live option. For me, it's like solipsism, something I just don't factor into my day-to-day considerations. And I imagine a Hindu shouldn't factor Judaism into her day-to-day deliberations, because it would just be, by parity of reason, unthinkable to her. And I think rationally, she's in a position where she shouldn't factor the truth of Judaism into her practical deliberations unless she's given an overwhelming amount of evidence. But on my view, there will be some people situated such that the only thinkable options are atheism or one particularly culturally salient religion. In my instance, it's Judaism. And therefore, I think in that situation, Pascal's wager, pretty decent consideration.
Well, it seems to be like, since the point of Pascal's wager is to provide a reason to believe without evidence, and what seems like your justification is just saying that people already have a bias towards some conclusions rather than others. And specifically in a religious context, you usually believe your God is the only possible God. And if your God doesn't exist, there is no God. Then if we accept your argument, then it seems to just imply whatever bias you have, you're going to accept, and because it's your bias. And that seems to be the only justification for why this principle would apply.
Well, so that's not quite what I'm saying, but I understand why you might think it's what I'm saying. So let me try and explain better why I think that critique doesn't land squarely at my door. I think we have an epistemic obligation to spend time in what I call the philosophy seminar room. In the philosophy seminar room, even things which are unthinkable should be scrutinized without bias, right? And nothing should be off the table. And I think that when we do that, we'll find that lots of our biases are completely unsubstantiatable, right? So somebody says like, oh, do you believe in magic then, right? So let's say, okay, I come from a culture that has a cultural bias in favor of magic, right? But in the philosophy seminar room, I say we have to really struggle to overcome our biases and look as objectively as we possibly can. It's always going to be difficult. Implicit biases are very, very difficult to overcome. But we should look at all the evidence we can possibly accrue. I think when you do that on the magic front, or the tooth fairy front, the evidence we amass is overwhelming. That magic, at least on some definitions of what magic is, just isn't part of the empirical world in which we live, right? So I think we will overcome many of our biases through what I call spending time in the philosophy seminar room. Granted, however, the biases that seem to survive philosophical scrutiny, I think you have what philosophers have called a pro tanto license to continue believing in them. So, for example, Bertrand Russell, one of my great philosophical heroes, he thinks that the job of the philosopher ultimately, and this I'm taking from what Wittgenstein called his Schilling Shocker, a book that Wittgenstein hated, but that I very much value, called The Problems of Philosophy. Bertrand Russell says, ultimately, we all come to the world with what he calls instinctive beliefs. One of Russell's instinctive beliefs at the time, by the way, was that there exists a world beyond the mental. Interestingly, it was an instinctive belief which he later came to dismiss. But Russell says we come to the world with instinctive beliefs. We need to scrutinize the data, come up with theories of the world, and the theories that we choose to explain the world will be the theories that win, given a whole host of different variables that we evaluate the theories by.
Let me ask a clarifying question.
One of them is explanatory power, one of them is simplicity, etc., etc. But all other things being equal, the theories which protect our most instinctive beliefs, all other things being equal, can be preferred. Yeah. Okay. So I'll take the question.
Right. So my objection to Pascal's wager is that I think the probability of a heaven under a god is the exact same as the probability of a heaven under atheism. If that's the case, then there's no benefit in believing in God or believing in atheism. The probability of going to heaven is the exact same either way, which would defeat Pascal's wager. So in this context, I would ask, regardless of what your inherent beliefs are, you would need some way to justify a belief that one of them would have a more probable outcome of getting into heaven than the other. And that's the part I would be missing, especially because Pascal's wager is non-evidential. If you don't have evidence with that one would more likely incline towards heaven than the other, then it would be irrational to put your bet on either one because the probability is the same.
Good. And this relates, I think, to something that I think the name is Sebi said in the comments, that this guy's mixing up descriptive and prescriptive claims. So I hate it when people do that. That would be like to commit what's called the naturalistic fallacy. I don't think I'm doing that. I think what it might look like to people is that I'm mixing up epistemic rationality and practical rationality. And what you're pointing to, I think, when you're demanding, evidence, right? There needs to be evidence for believing things. And Pascal's wager worryingly doesn't seem to put much weight on evidence. That's because he's trying to give a pragmatic rather than epistemic argument, right? He's thinking about practical rationality rather than epistemic rationality. I actually think that if what you said is true, then some version or other of Pascal's wager might be such that it should move you, which is to say, if you think that the evidence in favor of theism is roughly equal to the evidence in favor of atheism, so that given the evidence you have, it looks like the chances of one being true rather than the other are roughly equal, then practical rationality kicks in at that point and says, well, if the chances are roughly equal, but the expected utility of one lifestyle over another lifestyle is more, then the decision theoretic matrix should push you in the direction of saying, well, okay, I'll give this lifestyle a chance. Obviously,
Right.
if
Just
God doesn't
clarify.
exist,
I wasn't saying atheism is true versus God is true. I'm saying the probability of going to heaven under atheism, so no God, still a heaven, is the same as the probability of having a God and going to heaven. Probability of having a good life under atheism is the same as the probability of having a good life under theism. So I'm
good.
saying the benefits are the exact same under both.
Okay, so again, I suppose we need to look at which hypotheses are live, right, to us. And I think for each given person, the set of hypotheses which are live could reasonably be quite different from one another. So for some person, Hinduism is a live option. For another person, Christianity is a live option. For another person, Judaism is a live option. You might be in a position where the only live options are some sort of atheism with a heaven. Is that what you're talking about? Where it's possible to go to heaven under atheism?
Yeah, there's
Right?
many religions that don't have gods but still have
Yeah,
heavens.
exactly. And yet you have something heaven-like, whether it's nirvana or some other type of heavenly state. Indeed, Judaism thinks that, at least on some interpretations of it, that righteous Gentiles have a place in heaven, whether or not they believe in God and whether or not they believe in Judaism, right? So, you could be a Gentile who believes that that's true, right? And therefore you don't have, it depends on what's live for you, like I said, right? Which options are live for you. And then of the options that are live for you, you've got to then dig into real epistemic rationality, which is looking at evidence. So I happen to think, there is some evidence that renders it, to my liking, more likely than not likely that God exists. And then once I'm assuming that God exists, since Christianity and Islam and other theistic religions are just not live options for me, and therefore they would require an overwhelming amount of evidence before I should be rationally compelled to adopt them, Judaism kind of wins by default. And I think that's okay. The options which seem most intuitive to you, if they survive scrutiny, I think it's okay for you to carry on in those biases that don't get destroyed by the scrutiny that we do in the philosophy seminar room. So Charles says, I'm interested to hear the evidence phase. The evidence,
Well,
remember,
I don't. The evidence is a separate issue here. I'm more interested in
so for me,
suppose there's no evidence.
Well, if there's no evidence, well, for what? So I
The
think there is.
existence.
So I think
But say
there
I want to
is
keep
evidence.
the the live option. So keep your social conditioning and your biases and what your parents taught you and that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But no like empirical way to show that one God is more likely than another or whatever. And if you include Pascal's wager and all you have is your cultural biases of what you were taught by your parents, essentially, it seems like that shouldn't add to the probability that one hypothesis is more likely true than another. And so if we're going based on some kind of Bayesian analysis of what we should choose rationally, that should not add any rational way to choose one or another. And it seems just like the fact that you have a bias towards one religion over another does not in any way increase the probability that it's true.
No, of
Therefore, it's
course.
irrational to say that to adopt Pascal's wager only on the basis of the fact that you happen to have this belief and you're biased towards this one belief.
Well, so the distinction we have to make, and I think it's a distinction you're not making, is a distinction between epistemic and practical rationality, right? So a Bayesian analysis can only give you an account of what, given your evidence, is epistemically rational to believe in. But what some people think is that practical rationality and epistemic rationality can sometimes be in conflict with one another. Okay, so a classic example of this: someone puts a gun to your head and says, I can read your brain somehow. I've got a brain scanner and it tells me infallibly what you believe and what you don't believe. Believe that 2 + 2 = 5, otherwise I'm going to shoot you, right? In that situation, it can never be epistemically rational to believe that 2 + 2 = 5. There's no situation in which because there's no evidence that could justify that belief. Okay, the evidence is always going to be solidly in favor of believing that 2 + 2 is 4 and nothing else. And you might not be able to bring yourself to believe that 2 + 2 = 5 just in order to stop this horrible philosopher from shooting you in the head. But it would still be practically rational to try to believe it. if indeed you want to survive this situation. So, you might try and take a course of hypnosis in order to try and believe the false, or you might try to take a magic mushroom in order to believe the false. Clearly, in most situations, we should want to believe what's true rather than just what we're biased to believe or what we're pre-programmed to believe. Or clearly, truth is what our beliefs normally aim for and what they should normally aim for. All I'm trying to point out is that practical rationality and epistemic rationality can sometimes come apart from one another. You're right. The fact that it would be easier for me were Judaism true is no evidence in favor of Judaism. Nonetheless, I think epistemic humility should lead us to recognize that it's overwhelmingly unlikely that all of our beliefs are going to be true by the time we're done in this life. It's overwhelmingly unlikely that all of our beliefs are going to be true by the time we're done in this life because of human fallibility. And once I recognize that we have fallibility, I want to say, okay, given my fallibility, what is it practically rational for me to bet upon? What's it practically rational for me to believe in? And
I had a question real quick.
That person can change from second. The answer to that question is situation specific.
Well, so I would say that, like, if we adopt your model, it seems like it has the consequence of, if you are under the delusion that a guy has pointed a gun at your head and tells you 2 plus 2 equals 5, well, now you're pragmatically obligated to try to believe 2 plus 2 equals 5.
Yeah.
And I think that seems like Pascal's wager seems to be analogous to that situation in the way that you're framing it. Whereas I think for Pascal's wager to be rational, you first have to show, is this a delusion or not? And simply saying, using an epistemic standard that grants that if you're under delusion, you're rational to believe whatever the delusion wants you to believe for some pragmatic benefit, doesn't seem to be a good argument. It seems to be like just a logical fallacy, because that's what most fallacies are, just delusions of some kind. Here's an argument that we find rational that isn't rational. It's some kind of a delusion. But because you find it rational, it's pragmatic to believe it. Doesn't seem like a good argument to me. It seems like you're just adopting a fallacy.
So that doesn't seem to me to be, I mean, your reconstruction of my argument, that, I don't recognize my argument in that reconstruction of it. I'd say something like this. So clearly, I don't know I haven't had the pleasure of watching your stream before, and I don't know who you debate with in general, but I don't belong to a proselytizing religion. I don't think there's overwhelming evidence for the existence of God. So I don't think, it's something that everybody should be rationally compelled to believe. I don't think that. But I think there may be people in some situations in which practical rationality dictates that believing in God, or at least trying to inculcate belief in God, is a wise move. Let me try and explain what those situations might look like, and why I don't think they look like the sort of delusion you're characterizing. So let's say that I'm a Native American, okay, and some Christian comes to me to try to convert me to Christianity, right? I imagine that if I'm going to be convinced that Christianity is true, it's going to alienate me from the rest of my tribe, and could cause a great cultural kind of discomfort between me and the rest of the tribe. And therefore, I think that person is in such a situation where he probably shouldn't accept that Christianity is true unless he's given a heck of a lot of evidence, a huge amount of evidence, more than what would be rationally required by maybe someone in Western Europe in the back of a in the background of kind of Christendom. Is that because he's under some delusion that the Native American gods have him in this situation with a gun to his head? No, it's because he was born into a particular culture that, and that culture has some kind of value, and he's in a network of relationships, and those relationships contribute to his human flourishing. So So he's right to demand more evidence than an objective bystander or an ideal Bayesian reasoner should demand. He should demand more evidence than a Bayesian reasoner for the truth of Christianity before he jumps ship. Now, what happens if there's some evidence that his Native American beliefs are true? Well, I don't think he should believe with no evidence. But I think it's legitimate for him to believe with less evidence than other people might demand. That's all.
I'm not sure, because it seems more like kind of like a bandwagon or an appeal to consequence, where if you're in a society where most people believe, and if you disagree with that, then there's going to be some consequences to it. Therefore, your standard of evidence should be lower. But that doesn't seem rational to me. That just seems like an appeal to consequence or something.
The thing is, practical rationality should appeal to consequence. Epistemic rationality doesn't appeal to consequence. Practical rationality is all about expected utility. Epistemic rationality obviously isn't. And I'm talking about situations in which there's a prima facie conflict between the demands of epistemic rationality and the demands of practical rationality.
And why would Pascal's wager fit into the practical one? Because to me, it seems more like the delusion, because as an atheist, I don't think there's an afterlife. So it seems like I have a delusion that there's going to be an afterlife. And because I have a delusion there's going to be an afterlife, I should bet on what 2 + 2 = 5.
Yeah. Okay. So let me give you the situation I take myself to be in, right? I take myself to be, it's a very funny thing in culturally in the Jewish world. In most of the Jewish world, there's much less of a stigma around atheism than around becoming Christian or Muslim or Hindu. Because atheism is, loads of Jews are atheists, that's fine, right? But if you convert to another religion, it's almost like you're rejecting your heritage, you're rejecting your identity, and so loads and loads of Jews are in a situation where, given the way I define things, the only live options are the belief that Judaism is true or a belief in atheism. And therefore, all the other options, all the other possible religious options, they can't be awakened unless you give them a huge amount of evidence. So sans a huge amount of evidence, they're just off the table altogether. So we've got two options on the table, atheism or Judaism. In that situation, I think Pascal's wager becomes quite compelling. And he goes like this: well, I'm not going to presume that God exists and there's a heaven. I'm just saying there are two live options. Either God exists and there's a heaven, or he doesn't exist and there's no heaven. Those are the two live options for me. Now, what does the evidence look like? I think there's a small amount of evidence that God exists. But when you factor in the small amount of evidence that God exists and the huge prize that you win if it turns out he does exist, then the best practical bet in that situation where there are only two live options, atheism and no heaven, theism and yes heaven, if those are the only two live options, Pascal's wager becomes compelling. Now, how many people are in that situation? I don't know. I found myself in that epistemic situation. I think perhaps a lot of culturally Jewish people might find themselves in that situation. I think a lot of culturally Catholic people might find themselves in an analogous situation in which it's just Catholicism and atheism. Other people, perhaps yourself, don't find yourself in a situation that's like that at all. And I'm willing to accept that for you, the practically rational bet might not be a theistic one at all. Interestingly, I also think it's an a priori truth that if a good and reasonable God exists, it can't be the case that he conditions salvation on people doing things which, given the state of their birth, by dint of birth, were practically irrational for them to do. So I can't believe that, if Judaism's true, Hindus are damned and Muslims are damned, or that you would be damned if it would be practically irrational for you to adopt Judaism. And that's quite constant with my faith, because my faith allows that people can go to heaven without believing in Judaism. But I think it also puts the burden on the Christian, the Muslim, perhaps the Hare Krishna, who believe that you can't go to heaven or you can't get, without believing in their religions. Well, that would seem to be very strange if God is demanding the practically irrational of people. If I was a Christian in that situation, I'd go back to my scriptures and perhaps reinterpret things.
Well, I'm not, because it seems like if that's the case, Pascal's wager isn't doing any work. It's you already
It's
have
doing
some.
work for the Jew.
Well, it seems like you already have a bias for Judaism being true, and therefore you accept Pascal's wager. But Pascal's wager on its own seems to accomplish nothing in this case. It's just,
Well, it's not a bias for Judaism being true so much as being situated such that there's that I'm rationally licensed to view only Judaism and atheism as live options.
isn't that the bias?
Well, it's not really the bias. It's that it's that a recognition that the costs of Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, anything other than Judaism or atheism are so high that it's reasonable to demand more evidence for them than others. But at least between atheism and Judaism, I don't have a bias one way or the other.
Oh, right. So the bias here would be the prioritizing the two options, atheism and Judaism, over the other
Right,
things, which
right.
seems like just a bias because I have
Yes,
this
I
bias.
suppose these are biases that survive the sort of scrutiny I'm talking about. Yeah, both atheism and theism.
Right. So it seems like if you already have this bias that there is a particular kind of a God who rewards heaven, and you
No,
already
I
have.
don't have that bias. No, because I'm treating atheism and theism equally. Atheism might be true, in which
Oh, no. So
there's no
just to
heaven at all.
clarify, you have a
Yeah,
bias that a God would create heaven when atheism wouldn't. So you have to have that bias, because if you don't, if you're on
yeah,
my level,
that's right,
so yeah,
that's
if
right.
you're like on my level where atheism has an equal likely percent chance of creating a heaven as God does, it doesn't work anymore.
Yeah,
And so,
absolutely. That's why I wouldn't thrust Pascal's wager on you
right.
if
But so
that's
it
your epistemic
seems
situation.
that seems to be a bias inherent in most religions. Like if you're religious, you have that belief, but if you're not religious, you don't have that belief. And so it seems like that Pascal's wager.
Well, no, I'm not sure that's true. Let's take, for example, my atheist Jewish friends. Um, I think most of them would tell you that there's no God and there's no afterlife. Um, would you call? I suppose you would say that's a religious bias because it's a bias against some form of Hinduism or something, even though they're atheist.
Sort of. I mean, I would say
Mhm.
that if they're brought up in a religious context, like a monotheistic context, usually those religions and cultures teach that this is the only God, and without this God, there's no heaven. And so you have this inbuilt bias that if
Mhm.
your God is wrong, then atheism is true. And that's a bias that most people have. That's why when
Yeah,
you deconvert, you become an atheist usually instead of.
I suppose that my atheist Jewish friends and colleagues would say they don't believe there's an afterlife, and um, if you want to convince me that there's some possibility or room for an atheistic afterlife, you need to give me some evidence. Now, I,
Well,
I,
I would
I
want to
would
clarify.
demand
I'd want to clarify
I
one
would
thing really quick.
demand overwhelming evidence because of the of the background I've tried to give you.
Yeah.
But I don't even think there's any non-overwhelming evidence for such an afterlife. Do you?
I would say I would rephrase the question a little bit. I'd say, is the probability of there being a God with heaven any different from the probability of there being a heaven with atheism? And then most of them are like, well, I mean, at that point, there's equally little evidence for both. So I guess, sure, why not?
I
And
see.
that's kind of the way I look at it. It seems like I would require evidence for both, absolutely. But
Mhm.
if we're simply taking it from some kind of Pascal's wager analysis without any kind of large supporting body of evidence, and we're just saying, well, what's possible? Equal possibility on both. I don't see any problem. And then we go
Yeah,
into the
but
things you mentioned
like I said,
before, like simplicity. And I think simplicity, heaven without God is simpler than heaven with God.
okay. What, like I said, once you, yeah, and also by simplicity, I suppose God without heaven is more likely than God with heaven. If
Yep.
simplicity is your only, right, if
Right.
is your only evaluative tool. Um, I think that what we keep banging back to is whether or not we recognize that practical and epistemic rationality can be in conflict from time to time. And I think if you do accept they can be in conflict from time to time, I think it can be legitimate for somebody who says, "Wow, if I'm going to become a Buddhist and try to search for the Buddhist afterlife, there's going to be a much higher practical cost than there would have been to me had I just, adopted Orthodox Judaism, given my cultural context. If you accept that that's a legitimate consideration to the following degree, that it licenses you to require much more evidence for Buddhism than it does for Orthodox Judaism, then I don't think any delusion is doing the work. I think what's doing the work is a certain understanding of how practical rationality works and how it, how it factors into our decision-making processes.
Well, in that context, I'd be using delusion very generously or generally to include any kind of fallacy, bias, illusion, delusion, misconception, any of just the psychological states where humans prioritize some information over others for non-rational reasons.
Well, but it's non-epistemic because you're a Bayesian, I take it.
Well, I don't like Bayesianism, but it's easier to use. So, for the sake of the argument,
it sounds like, you see, it sounds like we're talking about epistemic reasons versus other reasons, but there are times where other reasons kick in. For example, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that friendship skews your ability to come up with purely epistemically rational beliefs about your friends. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that if you really have a friendship, you're going to be less reliable at assessing evidence against the virtues of your friend. You're also going to be less reliable in treating your non-friends and your friends evidentially equally, right? So then the question is, well, if that's a psychological inevitability, we can mitigate it to some extent. But if it's a psychological inevitability, is the epistemically rational thing to do is not have any friends? Or do you say, well, actually, there are other things other than my being a rational agent, there are other things other than my being an epistemically rational agent that contribute to my flourishing. And one of those things is having friends, because the sort of species that we are, the sort of being that we are. And you say, oh, okay, it's in my practical rationality to have friends, even if it's an inevitable consequence of that I'm going to end up being less epistemically rational. I just think epistemic reasons and non-epistemic reasons both have to play a part in how we define what it means to live a rational life.
So the part I would get hung up on is if I know I'm biased to be more considerate or more, I don't know, generous towards my friends, and I know I want to have friends, does that mean I should believe myself when I'm give them the benefit of the doubt? And I'd say, no, I think that because we know that you're wrong on that, you're more likely to be biased towards them. You should probably doubt that sensation, even though you can acknowledge you can have the sensation, you can acknowledge you have the friends. Now that you know you have that bias, you should probably not accept it as true. You should probably
what happens if I could demonstrate to you that even when you try to make those maneuvers that cancel against those biases, so you recognize you have this sensation and then you try and step back from it, what happens if I could demonstrate to you using empirical psychological research that you're bound not to be 100% successful at it?
That would be fine. You just try to be as successful as possible. I think
as successful as you can. But what happens if I tell you, well, look, you're going to be a much better assessor of evidence if you just don't have any friends?
If my goal was to be an accurate assessor of evidence, then I would not have friends.
That's right. So if your only goal in life is to have true beliefs based on as effective an assessment of the evidence as possible, then it might be that the rational thing to do is to have no friends. I just think that seems I think a mistake must have been made along the way if that's the case. And the mistake I think is being made is that when we shape our life, we do so in response to both epistemic and non-epistemic values. And I think that's part of what Pascal is actually hoping to point to, that when we make decisions, what sort of life should I live, we don't only do it in conversation with the evidence. We look at non-evidential costs and benefits.
Right. We believe lots of false things because they make us happy.
Yeah,
but that
that's
seems
true.
to be a problem, not like a bug, not a feature. And so
I agree that seems to be a bug, not a feature. I think what we need to do is have a fuller picture of what it means for a human to be a flourishing human. And clearly, one of the values that needs to have a huge weight is having true beliefs. We don't want to give up on that value. I agree with you. It's just I'm trying to get you to recognize that perhaps that value competes with some other values, and the question is how to navigate when those values are in tension one with the other. I don't think the answer is to give up altogether on trying to have true beliefs. That would be an overreaction, I think, to the conflict. But perhaps it wouldn't be an overreaction to recognize that part of what it means to have a practically rational life is to be willing to weight some beliefs over others when the non-epistemic costs of ditching a belief are high.
I mean, I think I can sort of agree with that, but I would say that when we're trying to compare these two different sets of values, epistemic values and pragmatic values,
Mm-hmm.
if I think it's contextually based on the question you're asking. Like if you're asking what is truth, pragmatic values go out the door. They're not
Oh, I
even relevant.
totally agree with you. Pascal isn't trying to give you an argument as to what's most likely true. That isn't what he's doing. He's trying to give you an argument saying, given the evidence we do have, the inconclusive evidence we do have, factoring in other values, what's the wisest decision to make in terms of which religious life one should lead? Now, I'm in a position, I take myself to be in a position where in order to do most justice to the position in which I've been born in, the network of relations that I have, my own social conditioning, my own social station, I take myself to be in a position in which it's legitimate for me to ask for a whole heap of evidence before I jump board to Christianity or to Islam or to Hinduism or even to an atheism with a heaven. And therefore, the evidence I'm first going to assess is the evidence between theism with a heaven and atheism without a heaven. And when I look at the evidence there, I see a small amount of evidence, I think, in favor of theism. Given my cultural biases that I take to be legitimate based on this tension between the epistemic and the pragmatic, that pushes me towards Judaism. The same evidence, I think, would push somebody else towards Christianity or somebody else towards Islam or Hinduism, depending on their cultural situation. And I think it is legitimate once I think that theism with a heaven and atheism without a heaven are the live options that I'm going to look at until I receive overwhelming evidence for something else. Whilst those are the live options, Pascal's wager is, a relatively decent argument. Not at all as universally decent as Pascal thought it was. I think it applies in very particular situations to particular agents and only for particular religions in those particular situations. But a decent argument nonetheless.
I'm still lost on the weight of the argument here because it seems like if it's the case that I believe based on purely my cultural biases that there's a heaven with God and atheism has no heaven, therefore I'm rational to believe in God.
Not quite. I think it's more like this. So the culture into which I'm born presents me with two live options: atheism without a heaven and theism with a heaven. I then go into what I call the philosophy seminar room, and in that room, I look at all of the options with as little bias as I possibly can. And I say, are there any other options other than Jewish theism and no heaven atheism? Are there any other options that have an overwhelming amount of evidence in their favor such that they need to be woken up? And I don't find any. Swinburne tries to, Richard Swinburne tries to convince me there's an overwhelming amount of evidence that Jesus was God incarnate. I look at that evidence. I don't see that that's very good evidence. Some people.
I want random question. So, say that the evidence for all of these positions is exactly equal to the evidence of your position of God, heaven, atheist, no heaven.
That really doesn't do enough because actually when I'm in the philosophy seminar room, solipsism probably has as much evidence as anything else. Thankfully, it doesn't have an overwhelming amount of evidence, and that's why I leave it in this. That's why I leave it in the philosophy seminar room and never factor it into my practical deliberations outside of the philosophy seminar room.
Well, so I would say that like I'm a fallibilist, so I think you can have knowledge without certainty. So I think I have knowledge of the external world. So I think the evidence for solipsism is very low. I think that we're in the matrix is very low. I think God is very low. External world science is very high.
I don't think that's right. I don't think that's right. I think in the philosophy seminar room, you should do more justice to solipsism. And I'll tell you why. Because your solipsism is only your anti-solipsism is only motivated, I suppose, by your fallibilistic epistemology. I also have a fallibilistic epistemology, by the way. But I suppose the solipsist wants to challenge the fallibilistic epistemology itself. And then we'd have to say in the philosophy seminar room, how much evidence do you have for fallibilism over some sort of qualified infallibilism about certain things, or over some sort of error theory? I think the water gets pretty deep pretty quickly.
Right. I think that's just contingent on which methodology you think can differentiate imagination from reality. And that's a legitimate argument. I think novel testable predictions works really well. If you can predict the future, then whatever hypothesis you can use to predict the future is reasonable to believe. And that I'm fine with. And given that methodology, there seems to be equal evidence for all the different God hypotheses. But if you're prioritizing one simply because you were born into a culture, that seems to me to be problematic. And then you would require a higher standard of evidence to overturn that belief seems problematic. Because if there's equal evidence for your position and some other position, you shouldn't just default to your position. That's like the opposite of, we know that because it's your friend, you're more likely to be more generous to your friend. You probably should not do that.
But I think that I hear your point, but I think that practical rationality at least pushes us in that direction. And then, as you said, sure, it might push us in that direction, but we should also push back from time to time, right? You say, like, I'm supposed to have friends, I want to have friends, but I know that makes me biased. I should at least try to mitigate that bias, right? I think that's a fair point. I think what might be playing a role in the background of my thinking here is that God also, if God does exist, and if he's anything like the sort of being that most of the world religions think God to be, then God also knows that there's an evidential tie between most of these religions, if there is an evidential tie between them, right? So whichever God really does exist knows there's an evidential tie. What must that God be doing to allow there to be such an evidential tie? I think maybe he's sanctioning our following our culturally entrenched biases. That's to say, since God has allowed the evidence to be roughly equal between all these religions, he's allowing my practical rationality or my bias to take the lead over here. In fact, this is what traditional Judaism thinks God did at the Tower of Babel, which is that God just divided humanity into loads and loads of cultures because he wanted that cultural diversity over uniformity. And perhaps one of the ways in which God ensures that is to make sure that, yes, there's some evidence for theism, but the evidence that would push you to one religion, one broadly theistic religion over another, pretty much tied. And therefore, because there's an evidential tie, God's okay with our allowing our biases to have the provisional final say, although that's an oxymoron, provisional final.
Well, I mean, I would consider that evidence for atheism, that there isn't a God who's actually caring or interacting with the world. I'd also consider the evidence for atheism to be greater than that for theism.
Right. So that's a different debate. I take the evidence for theism in general, a generic type of theism, to slightly outweigh the evidence for atheism. And then there's a subsequent question. Okay, now you believe that God exists. Is there any true religion? And at that point, I think there's something like an evidential tiebreak between lots of options. And given that I think practical rationality has some weight, clearly I want my beliefs to be true. But given I think practical rationality has some weight, I find myself to be in a situation in which Pascal's wager is licensed. And I think certain Catholics are too, and certain Hindus are as well. And if that is true, God must have arranged it to be the case on the assumption that theism is true.
Gotcha. I would like to have a conversation sometime about the evidence and why it would lean one way or the other. That would be fun.
Sure.
We did have a few questions from the audience, if you don't mind.
Sure.
P-Bot Thulu asks, just because you're more likely to auto-believe your friends does not mean your friends are going to give you a false information, untrue beliefs. That is falsy, is it not?
Yeah, I think we both agree. I think we all agree that the biases that you have either for your friends or not for or against your friends, they don't tend to be truth normed. That doesn't make it more likely that your friends are somehow virtuous, and it's something we need to be careful about. What we're recognizing here is that we care about truth, but we also recognize there can sometimes be other competing values. And the question or the things we've been discussing here is how to navigate that sort of conflict.
Gotcha. Question from Perfect. So what is the attendant cost of an atheist God who only rewards atheists? Let's see, atheists into heaven.
Yeah, so the question is, certainly for me, that's not a culturally live option. Two questions to ask is, first of all, is there any evidence that there is such an atheist God, right? And then the question is there overwhelming evidence that there's such a being, which on my model you'd need? And I think the answer to both of those questions is no. There's no evidence to suggest that there exists a God who only rewards atheists, and there's certainly not sufficient evidence to make it live for one's practical deliberations. So it's not something that concerns me.
I don't know. Wouldn't you consider the fact that because there's no evidence that can distinguish between the kinds of religions, there might be a God who specifically wants you to withhold belief rather than
I suppose the
giving you
question
license?
is, does a religion like that make it into the evidential tiebreak? I don't think it does. I think on the assumption that a good God exists, or on the stuff that I take there to be a small amount of evidence for, Islam, Judaism, Christianity, some forms of Hinduism, Sikhism, under some interpretations, they're all going to make it into the tiebreak. This, I don't think the evidence is going to be sufficient to get it into the tiebreak.
Gotcha. Question from Perfect again. How is this logic you were using different from looking for your lost car keys under the street lamp instead of where you lost them? Because that's where the light is.
Well, it is slightly different. The idea is, it's more like this. What happens if you have, although perhaps this isn't a fair analogy, but the thing that came to mind was, what happens if you just got a hunch that it's in the glove compartment and not in the car boot, even though you put the car you put your car keys in the boot. Sorry, that's English for trunk. You put your car keys in the trunk as pretty much as regularly as you put them in the glove compartment. But you just have a hunch they're in the glove compartment. Is it okay to kind of follow hunches? Well, the reason that's controversial is that some epistemologists think that hunches are actually epistemic evidence, right? But I was trying to give an example of where you have a kind of non-epistemic reason to think that it's there. I don't think that under this the ease of seeing under a street lamp, I don't think that constitutes a non-epistemic reason for believing that the keys are there, in the way that your friendship really could constitute a non-epistemic reason for believing that your friend is innocent of the charges brought against him. So it's not the case that any non-epistemic reason counts as a non-epistemic reason for believing something, and that's why I think the analogy of the street lamp isn't quite fair.
Gotcha. Cosmic QQ, thank you for the super chat. Nice to see you too. Hillary emails asks, does Sam I Am eat green eggs and ham?
Well, when I first read that story to my kid, I thought, wow, what an amazing story. He's never going to eat the ham because he knows it's not kosher, right? So, not in the dark, not even, what about when you're all alone in the house we're just with a mouse? No, I'm never, ever going to eat it. But then he bloody well eats it, doesn't he, at the end? And he likes it too. But no, I won't eat ham, green or otherwise.
All right. Question from Harry. If God doesn't send you to hell, why does anyone go?
Well, I don't know. I don't tend to believe in hell, but I suppose there are theologies and metaphysical views according to which one kind of goes to hell automatically, not by virtue of divine fiat. Indeed, as we've been talking about, there are atheistic religions that have things like heaven and things like hell. So I don't think it necessarily follows that if people go to hell, it's because God's sending them. There could, depending on what hell is and what, what the mechanisms are that lead people there. I personally don't believe in hell, so it's not really a question that bothers me too much.
Gotcha. I already got that one. Why would a God want to reward you just doing what is the best for you pragmatically, as opposed to following the hard truth?
Good. I think that's right. It doesn't. I can't think of a sufficiently good reason. That doesn't mean there isn't one, but I can't think of a reason why God would reward you for doing what's pragmatically best for you. What I do think is that God might, depending if you adopt something like a virtue ethics. I'm quite attracted to virtue ethics, although I think there are some issues there. If you do adopt a virtue ethics, you think that what makes you a virtuous person is eudaimonia, is like flourishing, and it might be that some part of human flourishing is maximize. It requires you to maximize your practical rationality, and the picture is that when you are fully flourishing, you actually end up being the best ethical agent too, the best change agent, the best advocate for justice, and the best doer of kindness. So if those things are all connected somehow with being the best practically rational agent that you can be, then you can start to see a picture in which that's the sort of thing that God's interested in. What I like about the theology I'm promoting is that God doesn't really care ultimately whether you have 100% accurate theology. What he really cares about is that you're a decent person. Now that might involve trying to serve God, but it doesn't. It certainly doesn't involve having 100% true theology. So that would be my answer.
Gotcha. Nick asks, why would Satan torment me? We're in the same side. We're on the same side.
I don't know why Satan would torment you. I hope he's not.
All right. Charles in Solo asks, how does his epistemology differentiate fantasy from reality?
Good. This is a really fair question. This is what's being pushed on me the whole time, right? The idea is that we want our beliefs to be true. A fantasist doesn't care about truth at all. We want our beliefs to be true. All I'm suggesting is that alongside truth, there may be some other values that can sometimes affect what it's rational for us to do, and even what it's rational for us to, so to speak, try to believe. I think a fantasist is somebody who doesn't care about truth at all. I think that epistemology aims at truth and nothing else. It's just I think there is sometimes more to life than epistemology. There's also practical rationality, which sometimes conflicts with epistemic rationality.
Gotcha. And Eves asks, what is your position on Abraham? Are you a literalist? Did Abraham exist?
Oh, it doesn't really matter to me. I don't think the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses, is intended to be a history book. And therefore I think if we try to evaluate it in terms of its historical accuracy, I think it's just like that's to misgenre the book. I actually think it's kind of anachronistic because history is a much later genre than biblical epic. So the point of the story isn't that there was a guy called Abraham. Was there a guy called Abraham? I just don't know. I don't even know how he'd go about trying to find out such a thing. Maybe.
Gotcha. I think that was it for the questions. Thanks for coming on. It was a really interesting conversation. Appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation with me. And do you want to give any links or references where people can find more about your work?
Well, that's kind of you. I have a website, samlebens.com, SAMLEBENS.com. And I have a book coming out tomorrow with Routledge, actually. It's The Philosophy of Religion, The Basics. It's part of their Routledge basic system. Thank you very much for having me. And it's really nice to meet you. And I appreciate the opportunity to rigorously debate these things.
Absolutely. Thanks again for coming on. I really appreciate it. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.